early IQ tests. These tests were used at the time to establish a statistical argument that Anglo-Saxons were intellectually superior to many immigrants. The results of children's testing showed that Italians maintained their, quote, position at the foot of the four races. Little boys in a New York City public school of different races and have them go toe-to-toe on these really culturally biased IQ tests against Americans. It's just like the most ludicrous thing I've ever heard. The indirect evidence is that immigrants are bringing our country down. The teacher's Italian subjects were also from South rather than North Italy. Hi, I'm Danielle Romero, and thanks for joining me today on my channel, where I dig into hidden history and questions about what it means to be an American. If you saw the video called How Italians Became White, there were a lot of comments on there. Just to set the record straight, I actually don't love the terms white and black. I don't think people are crayons out of a Crayola box. I don't think people really fit into these boxes. And I'll do a video on that sometime in the future. But today I want to kind of carry on focus of the Italian immigrant experience. A lot of criticisms against immigrants coming into America, actually by former immigrants, right? Because almost everyone that is here is an immigrant, except for the indigenous people to the Americas. By 1900, more than 1 million individuals were entering the United States each year. During this era, an anti-immigrant sentiment began to cast a shadow. People started to express concerns about immigrants, making various arguments against them. But one of the worst offenders was this argument stemming from eugenics. Around this time, there was a rise in the popularity of eugenics, this idea that one could improve the human population by encouraging reproduction of the fit and discouraging and excluding those deemed mentally inferior, those who belong to what some believe were intellectually lesser groups. The eugenicists were often proponents of immigration restriction, no surprise there. And they saw immigrants as the wretched refuse of society. Believe it or not, again, it was the Southern Italians who took the brunt of this mindset. There is a really interesting journal article from the journal The Scientific American from 1922, and I'll be pulling so much from this primary source. So I'll link to that below so you can check it out yourself. One of the things that the article said was, quote, the results of children's testing showed that Italians maintain their, quote, position at the foot of the four races, and that language cannot account for the low scores of the Italians. The fact remains that Italians were found to be very inferior to the other races, unquote, are decidedly inferior to the Americans, unquote. Now, this article, which we'll pull some more from, was actually written 2 years before the restriction on Italian immigration in 1924. Coincidence? I don't think so. In the book, The Mismeasure of Man, scientist Stephen Jay Gould explores the history of this anti-immigrant sentiment, and it's linked to these early IQ tests. These tests were used at the time to establish a statistical argument that Anglo-Saxons were intellectually superior to many immigrants. However, Gould revealed that these tests were deeply flawed and culturally biased. They measured knowledge and experience that was specific to long-term Americans, people who have been here in the country and would recognize the prompts and the idioms and the usages, would score higher on these tests. And they did way better than these brand new immigrants to America who were clearly at a disadvantage during these tests. But the test results showed what the people wanted them to show, which was that immigrants are bringing our country down. This is a quote. The deluge of this country, of the weaker stocks of Europe, will ultimately affect the average intelligence of the population of the country. It is commented everywhere that the better stocks are losing ground compared with the poorer in matter of offspring. So that is to say that the Americans who are already here are having less children than the newly minted Americans. The American immigrants are having more children than these first groups. The more intelligent classes are practicing, in one way or another, the conscious control of the number of their children. The result of this must mean a shifting in the average intelligence of the population toward that of the poorer stocks. Have we not been caught in the myth of the melting pot and in sort of a pious wish that all was well and that nothing could happen to us, unquote? The year this article was written was 1922, and it was a time of great concern and apprehension. The world was grappling with the potential implications of this huge influx of immigrants, especially from Southern Europe at the time. And back then there was this prevailing fear that these immigrants would somehow diminish the intellectual capabilities of the average American, like this quote goes on to say. Now, the author of this piece posits that accumulating evidence from studies on general intelligence of certain immigrant groups, along with research on the inheritance of mental traits, compels the reader in 1922 to carefully contemplate the potential consequences of this shifting landscape of immigration. That is to say, you guys better limit immigration before our country is ruined. That's that intention behind this article. Measuring intelligence has ignited a lot of speculation and debate throughout history. This is not something that we have all come to an agreement on, even now, on how to measure. And it's fascinating to delve into these historical perspectives, but we need to approach them with a critical eye and a dose of skepticism. And the author even goes as far as to say, these lower scores are not because of a language gap, and here's how we made sure of that. Well, it's not just a language gap. If you're brand new to a country, if your parents are brand new to a country, you're not going to have the same schema that a kid whose, ancestors came before the American Revolution are going to have. Now, despite all the biases that we can come up with to show how these tests weren't really indicative of an individual's intelligence level, they were effectively used by advocates of immigration restriction. And in 1920 and 1921, Congress actually passed laws that made it significantly harder for immigrants to enter the United States unless they hailed from Nordic countries such as England, Holland, North Germany, Denmark, or the Scandinavian countries. The Scientific Monthly article actually calls out the superiority of these races on page 22 of this article. Quote, in general, the superiority of the Nordic stocks over the others is evident in this table. Now, to substantiate the argument for limiting immigration from Southern Europe in particular, Kimball Young, in an effort to convince readers, presents a series of tests that consistently place Southern Europeans, Southern Italians, at a disadvantage. The author argues that the accumulation of evidence suggests that the continuous influx of immigrants from these, quote, weaker European stocks will ultimately impact the average intelligence of the population. They contend that these better groups are losing ground in terms of offspring compared to these worse groups. I don't know about you, but this is some scary stuff to read. Study that was conducted by someone named Miss Murdoch, who examined mental differences among racial groups in certain New York City public schools, particularly focusing on the issue of Americanization. So these are kids. Now they're going to say, okay, well, let's see how the kids are comparing when we pit them against each other in this way. The study involved Hebrew, Italian, American, and Negro boys in the upper grade. So American is kind of like a catch-all, right? I don't know how they were defining American, but it was its own separate, discrete group. Interestingly, the Italian group was handpicked, consisting only of boys deemed to have no language handicap. The results were perplexing, though, with the Italian group consistently demonstrating lower performance compared to the other racial groups. Now, while this journal's quotes can present a seemingly compelling narrative, you say, well, it's science. We must approach them with caution. It's important to critically analyze the evidence and consider the broader context in which these studies were conducted. And we should question the representation of the samples and potential biases that could have influenced the outcomes. It's really hard for me to believe that a immigrant child or a child of immigrants whose parents may not even speak English is going to do as well as a child who was grown has grown up in America. Like, um, that seems like a no-brainer. Quote, the indirect evidence is that Miss Burdock's Italian subjects were also from South rather than North Italy. Author uses the term Latins, and that kind of encompasses Southern Europeans. He says, quote, on the other hand, if the Latins, say, who come to us should prove to be but four-fifths as intelligent on the average and less variable when compared to the North European offspring in this country, the racial mixture between the two may be damaging to the welfare of the country, unquote. However, the writer stands firm upon the ground that the evidence points to the fact that these samples are very typical of the immigrants who reached this country from these European sources. Is not this, after all, a significant thing? He writes. For instance, 85% of the total immigration from Italy in the past 30 years has been from the same districts of South Italy. The indirect evidence is that the teacher's Italian subjects were also from South rather than North Italy. It's just amazing to me how at this time different nationalities were definitely perceived as not only distinct races, but they were ranked accordingly. Now, I think in 2023, if you ask most people on the street, like here in America, to say, can you tell me the difference between North and South Italians? You might get some jokes. You may get some like phrases here and there. I don't think you're going to have people saying, well, scientifically speaking, Southern Italians are ranking below the Northern Italians and the Northern Europeans on IQ tests. Like, that's just not part of the schema that we have. That's not part of our understanding. Now, we may have people applying that to other immigrant groups, but at this point, the Italians have been absorbed into American society. So it's just interesting to take those phrases about the Southern Italians and plug in any other groups, right? Looking at these tests that the Hispanics are decidedly inferior to the Americans. We can look at these tests and say that the E's are decidedly inferior to the Americans. Any group you could put in that, and I guarantee it is a rhetoric that we have heard. What is the rhetoric? Americans are not a race. Americans are not an ethnicity. Americans are a nationality. And I think conflating this idea that we're going to take these little boys in a New York City public school of different races and have them go toe to toe on these really culturally biased IQ tests against Americans is just like the most ludicrous thing I've ever heard. Has this mindset and this attitude really gone anywhere, or has it just changed shape? Today, Americans of European descent have been merged into this singular racial category, whites. Yet it is crucial for those of us who now belong to this club to remember that we were once considered outsiders. We were deemed part of this lesser race because of our originating heritage. These historical figures invite us to ponder the dynamic of nature and societal perceptions of each other and challenge these preconceived notions of these intellectual abilities based on race and just these ideas of separating people into these little groups. It's just absolutely fascinating to me. Now, these restrictive laws that came in the wake of these IQ tests and this culture, this national conversation actually had a profound impact on these ethnic communities in American cities. As the immigrants were looked down on, and as immigration was restricted during this time, the influx of these new generations stopped. And over time, these once vibrant enclaves began to be diluted and kind of lose their ethnic identities. Now, while vestiges of cultural heritage may have remained in maybe food habits and church practices, a lot of Italians are Catholic still. The subsequent generations identify more strongly as Americans than with their ancestral roots. The story of the anti immigrant sentiment in America is a complex one. Gould's work serves as a reminder that scientific studies, like any human endeavor, are subject to the influence of culture and personal biases. It challenges us to question these assumptions and stereotypes that may shape our understanding of intelligence and human potential of our neighbors. And how our perception of the other has changed over time and is still changing.